Hi class! So today we're going to be going over web design and online portfolios. Throughout the semester we've been talking about using InDesign to create individual pieces for either print or for the web. But today we're going to be focusing on how to actually create a website for yourself or for your organization. And hopefully by the end of this lesson you will be able to update your online portfolio so you can use it for graduate school admissions or for applying to a job. So first let's talk about how web design is similar to print. Just as we've been talking about all semester, you need to have a type of visual hierarchy, a focal point. You need to be able to control movement throughout the design, just as you would in InDesign when you're creating your own type of advertisement or brochure or resume. So with visual hierarchy, you can place those more important elements towards the top of the page. You can give them more visual weight by making them larger, by using a contrasting color. You also want to make sure you have a focal point, just like you would in any type of design. Putting it towards the top, as always, is usually a pretty safe bet, but you can use those rule of thirds that we've talked about to place it in different spots on the page, but just make sure you have a focal point. People don't want to be just looking at a wall of text. And kind of like when we looked at the design sins lecture, you need to be able to control movement. You don't want to just have so much text and so many photos on the page that people don't know where to look. It should be very easy to see. And similar to what we talked about with magazine layout and multi-page spreads, you need unity and you need consistency across pages. The look and the feel shouldn't change from one page to the next. So these are all things that are going to be similar when you're designing for the web and when you're designing for print. Now there are some pretty key differences. For print, when you have a color using CMYK, it's usually going to come out the way you want. Obviously it can change depending on the type of paper you use, but for the most part the color you use is the color you're going to get. Now on the web, color is going to differ from screen to screen depending on the quality of the screen and other factors with like the internet speed and that kind of thing. So the color can change, so you need to be aware of that. The layout can also change due to the browser. If the website you're using is not supported by the browser, you can have some layout issues where the text is overlapping and not aligning, which can also be a pretty major issue. So that's another thing you have to consider. You also need to think how this design is going to look on multiple types of screens. People are no longer looking at websites on just their desktop computers. They also have their laptops, their cell phones, their tablets, their reading Kindles. So there's a lot of different screens, and you have to think about how that website is going to change the size and look on each one and how usable it's going to be. One of the cool things about websites is that progression through them is non-linear. You can jump from one page to the next, and you don't have to be reading it in a consecutive order like you would with a magazine. With that being in mind, you have to be a little careful about how you are organizing information and organizing the pages, so that way it's okay if you jump from one page to the next and doesn't have to go in that order. It's also multi-sensory. You're able to embed videos and audio into these websites that you wouldn't be able to use in design that can really help get your message across. That's something that I would definitely recommend you consider when you're designing websites for yourself or for others in the future. And it can be interactive. It's no longer you just staring at a screen. We talked about during the infographic lesson how infographics are becoming more interactive now, where people can move the scales around to see what would happen if the statistics changed. So that's something really interesting about web design that we're not going to get into during this class, but something to definitely consider in the future if you do go into web design. So planning. When you're planning your website, you want to kind of create a little schema like this to think about how are these pages and these tabs going to work. So you have the home page at the top that can be connected to an about page, your portfolio, and your resume. This is an example for your online portfolio. But you can also have sub-pages to help your organization a little bit better. So the about page might just talk about you, but your portfolio page might lead to separate pages talking about photography, videography, and writing. So think about how you want those pages organized before you get started. So search engine optimization, or SEO, is something that I think is definitely a consideration you should make when designing any kind of website, and this would include for your online portfolio, but it's basically to make your website easily searchable for people when they're looking for whatever it is that you are trying to sell. So when you are planning, make a list of those keywords people might use to search and try to include those words in different parts. And this might be within different section titles on your websites, it might be in page descriptors. You can even include it in your domain name, which is really going to help increase those hits. So that when people are Googling looking for a communications specialist with a background in beef production in the state of Florida, if you have those keywords in your online portfolio, people are going to be more likely to be able to pull you up. So keep that in consideration too. Page design. We've talked about this throughout the semester as well. You want to start with a grid so that way you're very purposeful in your planning, and you want to also be able to control the sense of direction throughout the website. Whether that's with the use of color, the use of white space, and the use of photos, you can bring people's eye from the top of the page to the bottom. You also want to limit the need to scroll throughout the website. People don't want to just sit there all day and scroll. It's better to use tabs to navigate from one area to the next. And thinking about navigation, you want that navigation at the top. The navigation's at the bottom, it's going to be harder to find. People are going to get frustrated and not stay on your website for very long. So navigation near the top will also help. And keep your logo in the header. The logo is really who you are, who your organization is. And if that logo can link back to home, that's usually something people would expect to see on a website. And you want to make sure be able to get back to the home from any page, regardless of what you're on. So let's take a look at an example now. So this is a just homepage for the Florida Fruit and Vegetable Association. As you can see at the very top, you have the header in the navigation. You have the logo up there as well, and they have these different navigation bars that you can click from one to the next. You also have the content, which you can see is divided up into a grid, and there's a couple of columns there, and so it's not just one giant block of information or one giant photo or one giant block of words either. There is some variations there, and your eye kind of goes straight to that middle tab that says what's new at FFA, because they're able to control your eye with the use of white space in this case. And then at the bottom, you have the footer, which is usually going to have the organization's contact information, and this will appear on every page as well. So this is what you would typically see on a home page. So you got your header, your content, and your footer. So your headers, using these kind of navigation buttons at the top is a really good way to go. There's different variations of it, and a lot of times you can, if you click on About Us, like we talked about earlier, you can see a drop down. And that's typically how you would see the headers. You might also see it where it's on the left-hand side to navigate, but what you want to avoid is those drop down ones where you click and you drop down, because then it makes it a little more difficult for people to navigate throughout the site. So making sure you see the tabs at the top is going to be really helpful. Another way you can lay out your content is by using a kind of uniform grid. Now these are really helpful for if you're trying to do bios of your staff members, and it can also be used for if you're trying to show, this is what our organization does, and you can click on each of these individual ones to read more, but it's a good way to create a little difference in what you're showing, so it's not just one paragraph after the next after the next. Another pretty common layout that you'll see is this kind of like rotating feature is what they call it, where you log onto the website and it'll rotate through multiple images, pages, sayings, and it can be a good way to update on most recent news. You can talk about, 5 different ways I can help your company and list it that way, but it's a good way to kind of engage people on your website and make it a little bit more interactive. So that's a different feature you can use that we can take a look at in Wix here in the next video. And then design overall. What you're creating is this graphical user interface, which is pretty cool that you're able to do that. So you have to think about it when you're designing it, because Wix and WordPress gives you all these different options, and we just went over a few of them, but you want to make sure you're keeping it simple. When somebody goes to your web page, it should be extremely clear what that purpose is. So using just simple section titles that match up with your navigation button titles is really going to be key here. And navigation should be easy and should be the same on each page up at the top, like I talked about earlier, and it should look pretty consistent from one to the next. So just remember to keep it simple, keep navigation consistent, and make sure that your navigation titles match your page titles. Also, if you have a pretty complex website, using a search box will also be extremely helpful so people can find information a little more quickly. And finally, so designing for the mobile web. Like I talked about, you have to consider how your design is going to look from one screen to the next. And what Wix does that I think is pretty cool is it will automatically convert your website to a mobile site for you, and you can adjust it to make sure that it's set up correctly. But there's still some considerations you need to make, because on websites you might have to click on something, so you want to make sure that those areas are going to be at least 29 by 44 pixels, which is roughly the size of your thumb. So that way when you click on it, you don't have any issues, because nothing's more frustrating than trying to click on something and your thumb being too big for it. You also might want to consider simplifying the mobile content, just because people aren't going to be reading essays on their phone. They're trying to get quick information, so simplifying that information to just be what the people need is also a good consideration to make when designing for the phone. And also, making scrolling just one direction, whether it's left to right, which would be a little odd, or up and down, which is much more common. You just want to make sure it's in one direction so people aren't getting lost on this big web page that they're trying to move through on their mobile phone. So these are just some quick tips for the mobile web. Go ahead and watch the next video, and it's going to talk a little bit more specifically about how you can use Wix to create your online portfolio and edit it and use it to the best of your advantage.